Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked by a long-time viewer and reader of my works where, more precisely, I disagree with Ayn Rand in her views on war. Because while I do admire Ayn Rand greatly and subscribe to many aspects of her philosophy, and while I do consider myself an objectivist in a broad sense, though not in a narrow sense, war is one issue where I consider Ayn Rand to have been deadly wrong. And I mean that literally, because one of the deadliest activities in which human beings engage is warfare. And warfare is morally impermissible, in my view, precisely because as an individualist, I cannot condone the deaths of hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of innocent civilians who have had nothing to do with the causes or the wrong conduct that brought about a war in the first place. Unfortunately, Ayn Rand's views on war do have some amount of influence today, particularly through the so-called orthodox objectivists and their organization, the Ayn Rand Institute, which has recently been trumpeting every instance of U.S. overseas interventionism, including the most recent fiasco in Iraq, as well as trumpeting a U.S. invasion of Iran for over a decade now. So Ayn Rand made some comments during her speeches at the Fort Hall Forum during the 1970s, and the Ayn Rand Institute has proudly placed excerpts from those speeches where Ayn Rand specifically deals with war on its website in order to, at least in their view, justify their own highly belligerent positions. Those are positions that go beyond even what the Bush administration held its prerogatives to be in Iraq. For instance, the Bush administration still thought itself to be restrained by the traditional just war theory. Well, Brook, the executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute, wrote a very lengthy treatise about why he thought just war theory was inappropriate and dangerous and destructive. And furthermore, as a role model, he recommended General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, where Sherman deliberately burned the homes of peaceful civilians in the American South as a way to sap the morale of the Confederate government and effectuate a quicker surrender. For me, as an individualist, as someone who detests the notion of collective guilt, the idea of Sherman's March to the Sea and the atrocities that were perpetrated there, including the murders of innocent civilians, is thoroughly repugnant. So, what I would like to do today is go through those statements that Ayn Rand made and refute them point by point to show you that really her arguments on this particular issue do not hold up. And while Ayn Rand was a strong philosopher in terms of the fundamental ideas in her philosophy, she held many peripheral views, such as her views on war, that do not directly follow from her philosophy, and that a consistent view of principles such as individualism would actually suggest that the opposite is true. So, let's begin. Ayn Rand was asked, "What do you think about the killing of innocent people in war?" And this is what she said. "This is a major reason people should be concerned about the nature of their government. The majority in any country at war is often innocent. But if by neglect, ignorance, or helplessness they couldn't overthrow their bad government and establish a better one, then they must pay the price for the sins of their government, as we are all paying for the sins of ours. And if people put up with dictatorship, as some do in Soviet Russia and some did in Nazi Germany, they deserve what their government deserves. Our only concern should be who started the war. Once that's established, there's no need to consider the, quote, rights of that country because it has initiated the use of force and therefore stepped outside the principle of rights." Now, those were Ayn Rand's words directly, so I am accurately representing her position here, but I think it's completely false. And here are three reasons. First of all, people, including large masses of people, might want to overthrow a bad government, but do not have the means to do so and fear for their lives. This tyrannical government as is typical of tyrannical governments, might wield overwhelming force. And indeed it has to in order to stay in power, because most people wouldn't have let it stay in power if the leaders had just asked, oh, do you want us to oppress you, please? No, no. The only reason why that tyrannical government is still in power is because it already uses enough force to suppress not just armed revolution by its people, but even the merest significant political dissent. So the people should not suffer for already being thoroughly oppressed. That just compounds the injustice. In Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, there was a brutal tyranny, and Saddam Hussein was an arbitrary, capricious, bloodthirsty dictator. There's no doubt about it. But were the Iraqi people any better off when the United States federal government imposed decade-long sanctions that are estimated to have contributed to the deaths of about 1 million Iraqi children, and then bombed Iraq to essentially a pre-industrial situation where running water, electricity, sanitation were largely lacking and had to be rebuilt very poorly through infusions of billions of US taxpayer dollars? Is that just? Or is that just a further exacerbation of the injustice of Saddam Hussein's regime? My second point regarding what Ayn Rand said was her argument implies collective guilt and is thoroughly anti-individualistic. To take the principle of individualism consistently means that one must assign moral responsibility only to a person who is directly and actively perpetrating evil. The moral responsibility for evil belongs to its perpetrators and not its victims, not the people who are also suffering as a result of the tyranny of a particular evil regime. Countries do not initiate wars qua countries because there's no such thing as a collective agency. There's only individual agency. The leaders of those countries, the individuals within the governments of those countries who take active measures to initiate those wars, and to a certain extent, the members of the military, particularly the higher-ups within those countries who participate in those wars, are the only individuals who are responsible and the only individuals who deserve punishment. And to a certain extent, the more those individuals have little control over the initiation of that war and the waging of aggression, the less punishment they deserve. So a foot soldier who probably has been drafted by that tyrannical regime and who doesn't want to be on the battlefield, but if he doesn't fight, he will be shot by his own side. He should not be punished for the damage that is done in that war. His generals might be culpable, probably are. The politicians in that country are definitely culpable. But the principle of individualism requires a very fine discernment. The collective countrywide guilt that Ayn Rand posits in her remarks is the complete antithesis of individualism, and it has no place in a philosophy that champions egoism and rational selfishness and regard for each man and each human life as a value in and of him and itself. Third, Ayn Rand's argument ignores the fact that only proximate causation, or the so-called but-for rule, can legitimately be used to attribute responsibility. And this goes back to a long-standing legal principle within every free or semi-free country. The but-for rule says that it's only the immediate event that caused a particular harm, and the perpetrator of that event that can be held responsible for that harm. So let's say you are walking in a very disreputable part of town, and somebody trips you and causes you to fall on the sidewalk and injure yourself. That person cannot have the excuse of, oh, well, you put yourself in danger when you chose to walk in that very disreputable part of town. Because had you not chosen to go there, well, you wouldn't have fallen and injured yourself. No. If he hadn't been there to actively trip that victim, then the injury would not have occurred. So it is the last action that could have been avoided, but that brought about the harm, that is the action that's identified as being responsible for the harm. And the person who had a choice over whether or not to inflict that action is the guilty party. Nobody else is the guilty party. The doctrine of proximate causation is very important, and it's the only rational way of assessing guilt or innocence. Because if that idea were not true, if anything but the proximate cause of a particular harm could be held responsible, then any action could be traced back to and blamed on the acts of a previous generation, or even on the formation of the earth. Well, nobody could be held responsible for murdering anybody because, look, the earth was created some 4.6 billion years ago, and then evolution took hold, and lo and behold, human beings evolved imperfectly. Human beings did not evolve an innate capacity to suppress all urges toward murder and destruction. So, a particular murderer killing a particular victim, well, there can be no blame in that. That murderer was just acting out the consequences of imperfect human evolution. This is the kind of absurd, slippery slope that a lack of respect for the doctrine of proximate causation can lead to. Or, more closely to what some people might argue, a particular criminal's acts might be excused by reference to his poor upbringing, or to oppression by the broader society, be it his or somebody else's, or even by oppression from his government, if we are to make a closer parallel to the kind of argument that Ayn Rand is making. But surely most objectivists would be completely opposed to that kind of reasoning. They would say, no, the criminal has obvious moral responsibility for choosing to commit that crime. Well, I can make that same case with regard to the government of a particular country, say the United States, which has complete moral responsibility for choosing to bomb innocent civilians based on the calculus that they might get a few terrorists in those explosions. It is the same proximate causation, because they didn't have to engage in that kind of bombing. They could have done something that didn't have the effect of killing those innocent civilians. They could have sent a targeted assassination against those terrorists, a squad of people that wouldn't have hurt any innocent civilians. So I think Ayn Rand here makes numerous fallacies that neglect the very underlying principles of an egoist individualist philosophy. In 1976, Ayn Rand made further comments in response to a question at the Fort Hall Forum. The question was, assume the Soviet Union started a war of aggression. Assume also that within the Soviet Union there are individuals opposed to communism. How do you handle this conflict? Legitimate question. This is how Ayn Rand answered it. I'll pretend to take the question seriously because it's blatantly wrong. The question assumes that an individual inside a country should be made secure from the social system under which he lives, and that he accepts, willingly or unwillingly, because he hasn't left the country, and that others should respect his rights and succumb to aggression themselves. Now, this is a rehash of the old and tired, if you don't like it, then leave argument that completely ignores reality. Because an individual can see a suboptimality, or even a gross suboptimality, in terms of the societal and political and economic system under which he lives, but there's too much at stake for him at this point to just pack up and leave. Most people own sizable amounts of property that they wouldn't be able to take with them. Most people have family members that wouldn't be able to just get up and leave, even if that individual could. Furthermore, it may be very difficult to leave. One would need to travel large distances. It could be expensive and even dangerous, particularly if that country doesn't allow leaving and will stop you with armed guards at the border and possible criminal penalties, if not execution, if you try to leave. So it's not like there's this perfect world in which an individual can perfectly actualize the ideal situation in which he would like to live, and it's just a question of leaving a suboptimal situation. And furthermore, where would he go when everywhere in the world there's some measure of unfreedom to a greater extent or a lesser extent? And a particular individual may actually be better suited in trying to reform the injustice of the particular system under which he lives than to go somewhere else where he is not as well versed in the possibilities for reform. Now, that's not to say that nobody can leave, or that it's not practical or desirable to leave in any particular circumstance. But to say that one is morally culpable if one hasn't already left is ridiculous. Maybe it is practical and desirable for one to leave, and maybe one is trying, but one hasn't succeeded yet, and lo and behold, a purportedly freer country initiates a war and bombs that particular individual's home and kills him before he has a chance to leave. Is that fair? Is that just? Ayn Rand doesn't consider that time element in it, or the worthwhile nature of the attempts to leave that some of her contemporaries in the Soviet Union might have had. So, this is, I think, a completely unjustified line of reasoning. But let's see what she says further. She says, "This is the position of the goddamned pacifists," her words, not mine, "who won't fight, even if attacked, because they might kill innocent people. If this were correct, nobody would have to be concerned about his country's political system. But we must care about the right social system because our lives depend on it. Because a political system, good or bad, is established in our name, and we bear the responsibility for it." Well, whatever name politicians use to legitimize their authority does not make it so. I mean, there is such a regime right now called the People's Republic of China. There is such a regime now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is neither democratic nor a republic nor an actual Congo. It's Zaire. There's also a regime called the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, which is, of course, the North Korean regime now ruled by Kim Jong-un. Not at all remotely related to anything that people would actually want. These are regimes that terrorize their people into submission. And furthermore, being concerned about one's political system does not in any manner equate to a guarantee of success in actually reforming it. If it did, then in this very country, the concern of millions of people who are liberty-minded about the political situation would have already turned it into a country where liberty is consistently respected. And while we do not yet, thankfully, live in a dictatorship or a kind of totalitarian tyranny that quashes all dissent, we are very far from a reasonably, decently free society. So what Rand is saying here is, just because people were not successful in actualizing their concerns means that they might be deserving of death. So it's like, well, sure, you might want a better life, you might want a better world, you might have even tried to take some measures at great risk to your person to achieve it, but you haven't achieved it yet. So it's justifiable for another country to come in and kill you with a bomb, or as part of a shootout where you happen to be caught in a crossfire, just because you haven't been sufficiently successful in unseating that oppressive regime. And that seems to me a terrible injustice and a terrible disrespect to the aspirations of people in every country who are liberty-minded and who do want change and who do want their oppressive regime to diminish in its oppressiveness and perhaps to end altogether, but they're facing some very real constraints in their attempts to do that. And furthermore, what about the children? Are they too complicit in, quote, passively permitting the oppressive regime under which they live? And when did they have time to do this? Is it when they were in the nursery or when they were in the womb? When could they have a chance to get up and rebel? Before they learn to talk? before they learn to read, before they genuinely know about what politics is or what freedom is? What about the elderly or infirm who might want to effectuate reforms but are physically unable to do so? They're too frail or they're too ill. This attribution of collective guilt flies in the face of individual human identity and the reality of these people's situations. Ayn Rand continued in what I find to be a very alarming statement. If we go to war with Russia, I hope the, quote, innocent are destroyed along with the guilty. There aren't many innocent people there. Those who do exist are not in the big cities, but mainly in concentration camps. Now, this was back in 1976. I was not alive then. My parents were alive then, and they were alive in the Soviet Union, and their parents and their grandparents were alive. And I know for a fact, from having met these people extensively, most people there were not guilty in any sense. They were innocent victims who had many of the same human characteristics, the same ambitions, the same skills, the same desires, the same emotions as anybody else in the world. And they tried to do their best in suboptimal circumstances, as most people who are decent do. It's unconscionable that Rand would have said this when she, herself, still had relatives living in the Soviet Union. And while I can't look inside her mind, perhaps it was an attempt to distance herself from their humanity, to make her separation from them feel less intense or less affecting, or to express some resentments that she had against them. I don't know. I can't draw a definitive conclusion. But it did seem to be motivated emotionally. And it has no place in civilized discourse to say that one would hope for innocent people to be eliminated in that way. Civilized discourse that I would disagree with could include a claim that, well, it's regrettable that innocent people die, but that's collateral damage, that's the nature of war, some greater good might justify it. Now, I think that's completely wrong, but it is, I think, an acceptable argument in civilized society. But this is just bloodthirst, in my view, and as much as I respect Ayn Rand, I have to say this, because I do not condone it. From a moral perspective, this is the exact opposite of what a civilized person ought to be thinking and ought to be saying, irrespective of what that person's position on the morality or desirability of war is. Ayn Rand continues by saying, nobody has to put up with aggression and surrender his right of self-defense for fear of hurting someone else, guilty or innocent. When someone comes at you with a gun, if you have an ounce of self-esteem, you answer with force, never mind who he is or who's standing behind him. If he's out to destroy you, you owe it to your own life to defend yourself. And my answer to this is there's always another way. If there's this one-on-one confrontation, and you're an innocent person who is being threatened by an assailant, it may be possible to lure the assailant elsewhere and shoot him or escape him where there wouldn't be bystander casualties. And of course, every individual circumstance is different, but Ayn Rand had an excellent essay on the ethics of emergencies, where she specifically dismissed these kinds of lifeboat instant decision scenarios, precisely because they're not reflective of reality, and they're not what ethics is all about. Ethics is about the principles that animate day-to-day life. In such a situation where reasoned reflection and consideration of all the alternatives is possible. And sure, if you are in the heat of the moment, you're facing an assailant, you want to live, it's very difficult to react in an exactly desirable, optimal manner. You do essentially what is quickest in a manner that would save your life. And sometimes there may be unfortunate consequences, unintended consequences to that. But still, in many of these circumstances, there's another way. And this situation is not really analogous to a war in any event, because in a particular war, especially when the decision is made as to whether to go to war, whether to initiate the bombing of a particular city, say in the Dresden fire bombings of World War II, or the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which are, by the way, loudly endorsed by the Ayn Rand Institute. Those kinds of decisions are not act now or die situations. They do allow for extensive reflection and deliberation on the part of the officials who are making those decisions. And there is an inexhaustible variety of ways in which such a conflict might play out and either be escalated or de-escalated or even altogether prevented, depending on the actions and the decisions of individuals who hold responsibility for a large number of lives on their shoulders. So it's not appropriate to compare this to a mugging on the street. It's not a reflexive kind of response that is merited. Rather, it's precisely a very thoughtful response. A response that picks out the optimal outcome, the outcome that minimizes the amount of damage to innocent civilians. And in this world, one does not have to achieve perfection and achieve complete success in order to be a completely ethical person. But one cannot succumb to injustice or try to legitimize or rationalize injustice, where injustice is the deliberate infliction of harm upon an innocent other, without being unethical. So one could say, for instance, there is a terrorist somewhere, and this terrorist is known to have committed a criminal act. It may be possible to send a targeted mission to get rid of that particular terrorist, and with the best of intentions, just target that particular person. But someone happens to die, and it's a tragedy. I could see that being an ethically justifiable scenario. But in a war, that's ruled out of the question altogether, because a country enters a war with its leaders knowing that civilians are going to die. And their calculus isn't, we're going to try to avoid all civilian deaths, but if there are any, well, that's very unfortunate. Their calculus is, there's a certain number of civilian deaths that, while unfortunate, we're going to have to accept right up front in order to wage this war. And because all wars lead to this, is precisely why I, as an individualist, and as someone who believes that one ought to, at least in the attempt, be ethical and not deliberately condone injustice. This is why I find war to be unacceptable. In 1977, Ayn Rand further discussed this issue at the Fort Hall Forum. She was asked, can you defend one country attacking another? And her response was, the source of this kind of statement is the idea that nations do not exist, only individuals, and if some poor, non-communist blob in Soviet Russia doesn't want an invasion, we mustn't hurt him. First of all, a very emotionally loaded kind of response, and a very derisive response to characterize people who were yearning for freedom in an unfree society, which in itself was a tremendously courageous kind of position to take. So she continues, but who permits governments to go to war? Only a government can put a country into war, and the citizens of that country keep their government in power. This is true in the worst dictatorships. Even the citizens of Soviet Russia, who did not elect the communists, keep them in power through passivity. Nazi Germany did elect its dictatorship, and therefore, even those Germans who were against Hitler were responsible for that kind of government and had to suffer the consequences. So my answer to this is, it's not as if the citizens of Soviet Russia could do much against a highly organized and ruthless Communist Party and Red Army apparatus. And it's not as if the citizens of Nazi Germany could do much against a highly organized and ruthless Wehrmacht and SS apparatus. If they tried, as many of them actually did, they would just find themselves in a grave before they would otherwise have been. There was a student group in Germany during the Second World War called the White Rose, led by the now famous Hans and Sophie Scholl. And these were very conscientious individuals who found the Nazi regime to be unacceptable. So they simply expressed their dissent peacefully. They broadcast leaflets opposing the war and opposing Hitler's regime. And they were discovered, they were tried, publicly humiliated, and executed. And they did not hasten the end of the war. Rather, they just essentially sacrificed their own lives, because while they were good people, and they were very well-intentioned people, they were no match for the brute force of that regime. And this is one thing about the world, one aspect of it that Ayn Rand failed to recognize, and that is that justice and reason and virtue in the world do not always have might on their side. And when the forces of oppression and destruction and evil have more might on their side, they will simply overwhelm the forces of virtue and reason. And so sometimes the forces of virtue and reason have to play a kind of covert game. They have to bide their time and wait for an opportunity to resist the oppression in such a manner as to minimize the harm to themselves and hope to bring about a better day where being rational and virtuous and just can actually lead one to flourish, as opposed to be executed or bombed or shot and lose all chances at a further opportunity for flourishing. So the choices for most of these people were to acquiesce, flee, or be killed. And fleeing was not always safe either. And while Ayn Rand managed it, many others were blocked or died trying. So it's a tremendous risk. And for people who either took that risk and failed, or decided that it was too much of a risk, that they would rather bide their time and try to reform the system from within, however covertly, or just outlive the system and try their chances in its aftermath. To condemn those people, to judge those people to be guilty of death is thoroughly unjust and anti-individualistic and neglectful of reality and the constraints that reality imposes on people. Ayn Rand continues by saying, individual citizens in a country that goes to war are responsible for that war. This is why they should be interested in politics and careful about not having the wrong kind of government. If, in this context, one could make a distinction between the actions of a government and the actions of individual citizens, why would we need politics at all? Well, first of all, a government is not a perfect reflection of the will of its citizens or a mirror image of what they desire. This is why even in countries where purportedly the government is based on the consent of the people and the will of the people, we have fraud in elections. We even have instances of very dubious electoral practices, to say the very least, in the primary elections in the United States. So it's not like the governments give the people precisely what they want. It's not like the very few people at the top actually care about what the overwhelming mass of ordinary individuals would desire or what would be best for them. No, quite the contrary. Ayn Rand continues, all governments would be on one side in this situation, doing something among themselves, while we private citizens would go along in happy, idyllic tribalism. But that picture is false. We are responsible for the government we have, and that is why it is important to take the science of politics very seriously. If we become a dictatorship and a freer country attacks us, it would be their right. And while I agree that it's important to take politics very seriously, and this is a threat that we all, irrespective of where we live, might become the unwitting and unwilling subjects of a very oppressive government that engages in aggression against its own citizens as well as people abroad. So we would want to prevent that, and we would want to, in whatever way we can, contribute to the establishment and continuation of a just system of government that respects individual rights, that respects peace, and the opportunities that individuals ought to have to flourish through their own productivity and the use of their own minds. However, the politics of oppressive governments, governments that don't meet that ideal, are such that all people, foreign and domestic, are their victims. And it is not tribalism, but rather individualism, to state that all individuals of reason and conscience should find sympathy for other individuals who share these values, no matter where they live or to what constraints they are subject. Only by expanding what Adam Smith called the circles of sympathy through commerce and cultural exchange can people undermine the possibility of international aggression. A great example today is there is virtually zero likelihood that the United States and China would go to war, even though they do have many geopolitical tensions, and their regimes certainly have opposing perspectives in many areas. However, because the United States and China are so tied in trade, if either country were to initiate aggression against the other, it would be crippling itself. Frédéric Bastiat, the great 19th century French classical economist, said, "If goods do not cross borders, armies will." So, commerce and peaceful interactions with people from other countries are the surest way to prevent aggression and to soften some of the deleterious aspects of any oppressive regimes that might exist in those countries. But to instead call for war, or to embrace war, is the most counterproductive advocacy imaginable. War destroys those very opportunities for economic and cultural exchange, and prevents the process by which the goods and values of freer countries undermine the regimes of less free ones. As an excellent example, what if around the time that Ayn Rand was making these comments in the mid to late 1970s, the United States decided to go to war against China? Ayn Rand would have thought, well, it's justified because China is an oppressive communist tyranny led at the time by Mao Zedong, and the people there deserve to suffer because of what Mao was doing to them. Well, it's very fortunate that the United States government decided not to engage in war against China, because what happened in China was a gradual and certainly incomplete liberalization, but a tremendous improvement over what existed there during Mao's era. And this is precisely because China and the West engaged in commerce. And with commerce came opportunities to share culture, and for the Chinese people to understand that Maoism is not the way, that it does not offer hope for a bright future, irrespective of how Mao might have indoctrinated them in the past. Instead, it results in misery and suffering, and right now, even the Chinese leadership is trying to downplay the significance of Mao as a kind of embarrassing moment in Chinese history. And sure, these improvements do not happen instantaneously. They still haven't taken their full course or anywhere near it in China. But if we're talking about actual human lives, and what is best for actual human beings, bombing them to death is not an avenue that is conducive to human flourishing. If we want a world that actually embodies the principles of objectivism, and not one that is vindictively destroyed because people in many places fall short of those principles, then we need a very thoughtful and measured and deliberate and peaceful approach toward bringing those improvements about. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope I have convinced you that individualism and rational egoism are not compatible with war or with justifying the deaths of innocent civilians.